Hello guys, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm gonna be talking about Melissa, one of the deadliest marksmen in the game. In this video, I will also discuss how Melissa works in full details, which includes her passive, skills, builds, emblems, along with some tips and guide on how to use her in a match. So without further ado, let's get started with the video. Melissa is a hero that uses needles and puppets as her weapon. And she is the second hero from the Forsaken Light series. And unlike other marksmen, she has a really long range, allowing you to constantly poke the enemies without having to get close to them. But she can be quite difficult to use, especially if you don't understand her passive and skills. So, as always, in order to master a hero, you must first understand how their passive and skills work. So let's start with Melissa's passive. With the help of her passive, Melissa deals 125% additional damage to minions, creeps, and summoned units. Meaning your damage will be increased when attacking minions, creeps, and summoned units. And summoned units include Vexana's ultimate, Popol's wolf companion Koopa, and Zask's first skill Nightmaric Spawn. Compared to other marksmen, Melissa's passive is kind of funny, but it surely comes in handy, especially when playing against annoying heroes like Zask and Vexana, as your passive will allow you to swiftly kill their summoned units. Now, let's talk about her first skill. With the help of her first skill, Melissa dashes in the target direction and gains extra attack speed for 3 seconds. This skill is very similar to Moskov's first skill. And this skill is your main source of mobility, so make sure to use this skill to reposition or escape during teamfights. And if timed correctly, you can also use this skill to dodge the enemy's attacks and skills. And make sure to always keep using this skill during fights, as the attack speed bonus you gain from this skill is pretty useful. Now, let's talk about her second skill. With the help of her second skill, Melissa throws muddles in a target direction, dealing 250 physical damage on the first hit, and also links nearby enemies up to 6 seconds. And enemies that get linked by this skill will be slowed by 60%, and upon linking to the enemies, a red button will appear near the basic attack. And if you tap on the red attack button, Melissa will use her basic attacks on muddles, and enemies linked with muddles will get hit even if they are far away from you. This skill is what makes Melissa so dangerous and annoying, as you can constantly use this skill to keep poking the enemies. But remember, if the enemies move too far away from muddles, the link will be broken. And you can also use your first skill to reposition your second skill, which is quite useful, especially when the enemies are trying to escape. So always make sure to use your second skill first, and then your first skill to reposition yourself in your second skill, so that you will have higher chances of killing the enemies. And you can also use this skill to check the bushes for enemies, so make sure to take advantage of that when using Melissa. Remember, this skill is Melissa's main source of damage and also a debuff which slows the enemies. So make sure to get this skill at level 1 to poke the enemy marksman. Now, let's talk about her ultimate skill. With the help of her ultimate, Melissa creates a magical shield-like field around herself. And when the enemies try to enter the field, they will continuously get knocked back, dealing magic damage to the enemies that try to enter, all while knocking them back. And your ultimate will move with you while it's activated. This skill is a defensive ability, but you can also use this offensively by using it when the enemies are near the wall. And if you use this skill while the enemy is near a wall, you can pin the enemy to the wall like a Kai's ultimate. Plus you can still use your basic attacks, which makes this skill a lot better. And remember, your ultimate can pretty much block all kinds of attacks if timed correctly. But heroes with long-range skills might still be able to kill you even if you use your ultimate, as your ultimate only stops the enemies from entering, and it doesn't stop the enemy's abilities from hitting you. So make sure to keep your distance when the enemy's mage is around, as long-range skills, targeted abilities, and AoE damage can still hit you from outside the barrier. So I'd recommend you to use your ult only against melee heroes, as long-range heroes will still be able to hit you even if you use your ult, making your ultimate useless against heroes with long-range basic attacks and abilities. And unlike other ultimate skills, Melissa's ultimate has a passive ability, and upon learning this skill, you will gain 3 magical and physical defense. And this effect is increased to 5 times when you use her ultimate, meaning you will gain up to 15 hybrid defense when you use your ultimate, which is pretty good in my opinion, as it increases your survivability. Now, let's talk about her builds and emblems. For her builds, you can use different kinds of builds depending on your playstyle and preference. But out of all the builds, 2 builds stand out the most, and those are Critical and Trinity build. And in my opinion, the Critical build is the best, as you can melt the enemy heroes in an instant without much problem. And for the Critical build, you must go for these items. This build is called the Critical build, and it's also one of the strongest builds for a marksman. And you should easily be able to melt and dominate the enemies using this build. But I'd recommend you to go for this build only if the enemies have 3 or more squishy heroes. And if the enemies pick tanky heroes, then you must go for this build. This build is called Trinity build, and it will allow you to go toe-to-toe against tanky enemies. And I'd recommend you to use this build only when the enemies have 3 or more tanky heroes. But if you still want to use the Critical build against tanky enemies, then I'd recommend you to replace Corrosion Side with Demon Hunter Blade. And remember, you don't need to buy boots when using the Critical build, as you will still get around 30% movement speed from just these 3 items alone, which is more than enough. Now, let's talk about her emblems and talents. For Melissa, the Marksman emblem is the best emblem for her. And for her talents, I'd recommend you to go for these talents if you're using the Trinity build. But if you're using the Critical build, then I'd recommend you to go for these talents. Remember, these are my recommendations, and different people will usually prefer different kinds of emblems and talents, depending on their playstyle and preference. But I've personally tested these builds and emblems myself, and these sets of builds and emblems were 2 of the best. Now, let's talk about her gameplay and how to use her in a match. During the start of the game, make sure to unlock your second skill first. And once you have your second skill, you must try to poke the enemy as much as you can. But remember, you must only poke the enemy from afar, and you shouldn't take a proper fight with the enemy marksman, as Melissa is not very strong during the early game. And make sure to try last hitting the minions, as last hitting the minions will grant you more gold. Remember, your priority during the early game should be reaching level 4 as soon as possible. And I'd recommend you to take fight only after you reach level 4, as Melissa is kind of weak during the early game. And make sure to constantly keep an eye on the mini-map, as the enemy hyper will definitely try to gank your lane. And remember, if you do not see the enemies on the mini-map, then they are probably coming your lane to gank you. So I'd recommend you to stay inside your turret if you don't see the enemies in the mini-map. So, your early game priorities should be farming, poking the enemy marksman, and reaching level 4 as soon as possible. Now, let's talk about her mid-game. During the mid-game, you should have at least 1 or 2 of your core items. And this is the stage where Melissa starts to shine the most. And your main priority during the mid-game should be pushing the turrets, and helping your teammates by joining the teamfights. And whenever there is a teamfight, I'd recommend you to always stay behind your team and wait a few seconds before entering the fight. Remember, the enemies will always try to kill you first, as you are the main damage dealer of the team. So you must be mindful of that, and try playing as safe as possible. I'd recommend you to enter the teamfight only when you see all the enemies in the mini-map. Because if you do not see all the enemies in the mini-map, then it probably means some of them are hiding in the bush waiting to ambush you. So always make sure to keep that in mind. And aside from teamfight, you must also try to help your jungler take the turtle whenever possible. And pushing the turrets and farming should be your main priority during this stage. Remember, mid-game is the only time where you will be able to push the turrets properly, because during the late game, the enemies will always hide in the bush, waiting to catch you off guard. Plus pushing the turrets during the mid-game is also the safest. because you will constantly have to help your teammates in teamfight during the late game. So always make sure to keep that in mind. So, your priorities during the mid-game should be pushing the turrets, helping your jungler take the turtle, and helping your teammates by joining the teamfight. Now, let's talk about her late game. During the late game, you should easily be able to melt the enemies without much problem. But remember, you must never rotate alone during the late game, as the enemies will probably be camping, waiting for you. And you must always check the bushes before entering them, as you never know if the enemies are camping. And remember, even if you have a bad start, you must never lose hope as the marksman. Because even though the marksmen are the weakest during the early game, they are usually the strongest during the late game. So always make sure to keep that in mind. And if possible, I'd recommend you to only rotate with your tank or fighter during the late game. So that even if the enemies launch a surprise attack, your tank and fighter can act as your shield, allowing you to fight back. And remember, timing and positioning is the key to winning during the late game. So always be wary of your positioning during a teamfight, as one wrong move is all it takes for the enemies to send you back to base. Remember, even though you can deal a lot of damage, you are still a squishy marksman at the end of the day. And the enemies will easily be able to kill you if you are out of position. Remember, the victory of the team mostly depends on the marksman during the late game. So never make foolish decisions like rotating alone and split pushing when your teammates need you. Remember, in order to split push, your teammates must be able to handle the enemies without you. But if you're the one carrying your team, then I'd recommend you to stick with your team, and try winning together as a team instead. And I'd recommend you to take the Lord only when you're dominating the game, or when the enemy's jungler is dead. And remember, it's always a good idea to take the Lord whenever possible, as taking down the Lord will greatly increase the chances of ending the game. But if all the enemies are alive and you feel like it's too risky to take the Lord, then I'd recommend you to not take the Lord. Because if your team and the enemy's team are in a 50-50 position, then the one who gets the Lord are usually the ones who win in higher ranks. So, what do you think about Melissa? Make sure to let me know your thoughts in the comments, and consider leaving a like on the video if you haven't. And subscribe to my channel if you're new. I make tutorials and informative videos about the game. Thank you for watching.